Sarah placed her hand lightly on Isaac's arm, a gesture of support. "I was a soldier once," he began, his eyes distant. "I served overseas. I thought I was doing something good, protecting people, serving my country." Sarah nodded, thinking of her own husband, Carter, and the pride he had taken in his service. "It's a noble calling," she replied softly. Isaac's smile was bitter. "Maybe, but it comes at a cost." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "While I was deployed, my wife cheated on me. She said she couldn't handle the distance, the uncertainty. When I came back, I found divorce papers waiting for me." Sarah's grip on Isaac's arm tightened slightly, a silent show of support. She could see the pain etched in the lines of his face and hear it in the tremor of his voice. "I thought I could handle it," Isaac continued, his voice breaking. "I thought I was stronger than that. But the betrayal, it broke something in me. I started drinking just to numb the pain." He trailed off, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I couldn't hold down a job. I lost my apartment. The part-time gig at the grocery store was all I had left. It wasn't much, but it covered food." He hesitated, shame coloring his words. "I was staying at a cheap motel." Sarah felt her heart constrict. This young man, who had shown such strength in defending her, was carrying a heavy burden. "Oh, Isaac," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Isaac looked up, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "When I saw that officer humiliating you, something just snapped. I couldn't stand by and watch it happen. Not again. Not to someone who didn't deserve it." The weight of Isaac's words hung in the air between them. Sarah felt a surge of emotions, gratitude for his kindness, sorrow for his struggles, and a growing determination. "Isaac," she said softly, her voice warm, "what you did for me meant more than you could know. You gave me back my dignity when others were trying to take it away." Isaac smiled weakly, but there was a flicker of pride in his eyes. "I'm glad I could help, Mrs. Sarah, even if it cost me everything else." Sarah straightened her back, her decision crystallizing in her mind. "Not everything, Isaac. Not if I have anything to say about it." She stood up, her joints creaking in protest, and held out her hand to him. "Come with me. I insist you join me for a meal." Isaac hesitated, embarrassment clouding his features. "Mrs. Sarah, I appreciate the offer, but I don't want to be a burden." "Nonsense," Sarah said firmly, her tone brooking no argument. "You stood up for me when I needed it most. Now it's my turn to stand up for you." After a moment's pause, Isaac took her outstretched hand, allowing her to help him to his feet. Together, they made their way to a small cafe nearby, drawing curious glances from passers-by. The cafe was a cozy establishment tucked away on a quiet corner. As they settled into a booth near the back, Sarah couldn't help but notice Isaac's discomfort. His eyes darted around nervously and he seemed to shrink into himself, as if trying to become invisible. "Order whatever you like, dear," Sarah said gently, pushing the menu toward him. "Don't you worry about a thing," Sarah reassured Isaac as he picked up the menu, his hands trembling slightly. "You don't have to do this," he replied hesitantly. "I want to," she insisted. "Now, tell me more about yourself. Where did you serve?" As they waited for their meals, Isaac slowly began to open up, sharing stories of his time in the army, the friends he'd made, and the hardships he'd faced. Sarah listened intently, her heart aching for the young man who had experienced so much pain in his short life. "You know," she said softly as their meals arrived, "my husband Carter was a soldier too. He served in Vietnam. Isaac looked up, interest sparking in his eyes. Really? What branch? Army, just like you, Sarah replied, a fond smile playing on her lips. He was so proud to serve his country. Her voice faltered slightly, and sensing her emotion, Isaac leaned in. What happened, if you don't mind me asking? Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself. She rarely spoke about Carter's condition, but something about Isaac's earnest gaze made her want to share. It was during his second tour. There was an accident, a spinal cord injury. The doctors did what they could, but Carter was left partially paralyzed. Her voice trembled as she continued. Over the years, it's gotten worse. Now he needs constant care. That's why I was buying those diapers at the store. Understanding dawned in Isaac's eyes. Mrs. Sarah, I had no idea. I'm so sorry. She shook her head, a small smile gracing her features. Don't be sorry, dear. Carter and I have had a good life together. It's not the one we planned, but it's ours. We face each day together, and that's what matters. As they continued talking, a bond began to form. Isaac shared more about his struggles with addiction and homelessness, while Sarah spoke of the challenges of being a full-time caregiver. Despite their age difference and varied experiences, they found common ground in their shared hardships and resilience. As the meal came to an end, Sarah made a decision. Isaac, she said, her voice firm yet kind, I want you to come home with me and meet Carter. We have a spare room, and I think we could help each other. Isaac's eyes widened in surprise. Mrs. Sarah, I couldn't possibly. You've already done so much. Nonsense, she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. You need a place to stay, and frankly, I could use an extra pair of hands around the house. It's not charity. It's what decent folks do for each other. For a moment, Isaac was silent, overwhelmed by her unexpected kindness. Then, slowly, he nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Sarah. I don't know what to say. Sarah smiled and reached for his hand once more. You don't have to say anything, dear. Just come home with me. Let's see where this new chapter takes us. As they left the cafe together, Sarah felt a warmth in her heart that had been absent for too long. She didn't know what the future held, but she sensed that things were about to change for the better. As they made their way to her home, Sarah noticed Isaac's nervousness. His eyes darted around, taking in the modest houses lining the street, and his hands fidgeted with the hem of his worn jacket. Now, don't you worry, she said softly, patting his arm. Carter's a good man. He'll be glad to meet you. When they stepped inside, the familiar smell of home enveloped them, a mixture of lavender air freshener and the lingering aroma of Sarah's cooking. Isaac's eyes darted around, taking it all in. As Sarah and Isaac entered the living room, he took in the worn yet well-kept furniture, the family photos adorning the walls, and finally, the hospital bed in the corner where Mr. Carter lay. Carter, dear, Sarah called out. We have a visitor. This is Isaac, the young man I told you about. Mr. Carter's eyes, still sharp and alert despite his immobile body, focused on Isaac. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. Then, to Sarah's surprise and delight, Isaac stepped forward, instinctively straightening his posture. It's an honor to meet you, sir, he said, his voice filled with a deep respect. Mr. Carter's eyes crinkled at the corners, his version of a smile, and Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched the two men begin to connect. Isaac pulled up a chair next to the bed, and Mr. Carter's encouraging gaze invited him to sit. As they began to share stories about their time in service, Sarah quietly slipped into the kitchen to prepare some tea. sensing that something significant was unfolding in her living room, something that could change all their lives for the better. In the days that followed, a remarkable transformation began in the Carter household. Initially hesitant, Isaac quickly became a vital part of their daily routine. Sarah watched with joy as he eagerly took on household repairs that had long been neglected, his hands steady with newfound purpose. However, it was the bond forming between Isaac and Mr. Carter that truly warmed her heart. The two men spent hours together by the bedside, sharing stories and laughter. As weeks turned into months, Isaac's determination grew. One evening, Sarah overheard him speaking softly to Mr. Carter about seeking help for his drinking problem. The support and understanding in Mr. Carter's eyes seemed to give Isaac the strength he needed to take that first step. Isaac began attending support group meetings and started therapy, tackling his trauma with newfound determination. He also began job hunting, eventually landing a position as a maintenance technician at a local community center. He often shared his progress with Mr. Carter, whose eyes radiated a fatherly pride and encouragement that his voice could not convey. The change in Isaac was extraordinary. The hollow-eyed young man who had once sat on the street corner became a man filled with purpose, standing tall and ready to face each day. Sarah, too, felt the weight of her responsibilities lift. With Isaac's help, caring for Mr. Carter became more manageable. For Mr. Carter, the sparkle returned to his eyes, and though his body remained motionless, his spirit soared as he witnessed Isaac's progress. Over time, Isaac became more than just a helper or a guest. He became the son Mr. and Mrs. Carter had longed for, but were never able to have. The injury Mr. Carter sustained in the war had left them unable to conceive, a silent sorrow they had carried for years. Now, in this unexpected twist of fate, they found themselves with a grown son who brought energy and life into their home. In their modest house, 3 souls found healing in one another. Sarah, once burdened by solitude and endless responsibilities, discovered joy in nurturing a young man back to health and purpose. Mr. Carter, although physically constrained, found a new voice through Isaac, who translated his silent wisdom into action. And Isaac, who once felt lost and alone, found not just a home, but a renewed purpose in life, transformed by the unconditional love and quiet strength of the elderly couple.